Sorry, Henrik. We'll edit this from the copy. Welcome to this month's developer forum. It's quite an interesting topic this week, something I've never actually thought about before, which is how one might go about the machinery behind providing translated messages through, I guess, all software, but we're going to focus obviously on R and R packages and things. As a native English speaker, it's something I've never really thought about or worried about particularly. So I'm really interested to know both the kind of engineering behind it, what's involved in doing this, because I guess we're aware that things like R can provide messages in different languages, but I have no idea how to go about it, either myself or how the people have done it in R and things, and also probably to discuss the kind of how much burden it is on developers and things to maintain this and support this, and whether our community is equipped to do that, and whether we want to try and focus on doing that and things. So Martin's going to lead this kind of, hopefully with a discussion or a demonstration or something. I don't know what Martin's got prepared for us, but the floor is yours, Martin.
All right, thanks, Mike. Actually, for some reason, I've prepared some slides. I just pasted the link into the chat, and I'll share my screen. But before doing that, I'll present mode, and then I'll share my screen. So do you see the slides? Yes, great, perfect. I should say I'm a complete novice at this. Kind of thought about it a couple of months ago, seemed like a good idea, then accidentally said something at the end of the last developer forum. And then we've been working on it since then. But Mike Shirako is on the call, and he's actually an expert on this. So if we get
yeah, I don't think by any stretch of the imagination I would call myself an expert, but yeah, I'm happy to weigh in when I can.
Yeah, perfect.
Thanks for the invite, by the way.
Yeah, it's super to have you. Yeah, so this is actually what you can do with a branch of BioC Manager right now. You can start it and type a command and get an English language error message, repo argument to install not allowed, and then execution halted. But you can change your language environment to French, execute the same command, and then get the error message in French, both from BioC Manager, but also execution arrêté. That's from base R, a base R translation. You can also get the message in Spanish and in Japanese and in Chinese. And there's also maybe a little bit, we shouldn't reinforce stereotypes, but there is an Italian translation proposed, and then a bunch of Italians got together and they're all discussing the exact formulation, probably with a lot of hand gestures and so on, about how they should be, the messages should be translated. So this is totally great. So I should say that just about my own motivation, I'm kind of like Mike. I can speak English pretty well, but actually I don't really know the rules of grammar or anything like that. But I like to travel, and when I travel, you come across different experiences kind of at sea in the language that you're dealing with and so on. And you provide workshops to people who are trying to learn to use Bioconductor. And they often struggle both with R and then with understanding what's going on their screen. And I know that when I see an error message, it's really important to kind of like decode it, right? Like figure out what it's trying to tell you. In the context of the software that's being run, the code that you just ran, you look up above at what you wrote and try and parse what the error message is telling you and relate it to what's going on up above. And so this combination of enjoying traveling and seeing the world and recognizing the diversity of people out there, and also knowing how important it is to evaluate complicated error messages context. Very exciting. I've got jets going overhead here. Hope it's okay. Pretty close to the Canadian border. It could be the Canadians down. But anyway, that's kind of my motivation, thinking that this would be totally cool to be able to translate these errors in a way that helped other people understand and get into using R and Bioconductor. And then what better place to do that than in our gateway package, BioC Manager? If you can't use BioC Manager, you can't use any of Bioconductor. So it seems like a perfect place to start. So it turns out that it's pretty straightforward to do. You've probably written stop, warning, and messages, and then maybe not this get textf, but maybe sprintf, the sort of C-style language sprintf. In R files, like in BioC Manager, there's a file called install.r, and it says approximately stop repo argument to install not allowed.
We can't hear you, Mike. Martin?
Me neither.
We saw that you were moving lips, but
We lost him.
yeah,
He got fighter jets. Didn't sound good.
hopefully it's not about the Jets.
Maybe because he showed some Chinese in the slides, the US
Now they're
government
enemies.
already,
Yeah, Martin as an enemy. Damn it.
or the Chinese government.
I think Roswell was having network connectivity issues. I had a meeting with him this morning and the
Okay,
connection was not that great, so he might just pop back on in a minute.
okay.
Bye.
Thanks, Claudia.
In the meanwhile, people on the call, has anyone done this before? Looked into it?
Not really. But
I just did this Spanish translation for BioC Manager, but
Okay.
the 2/3 of the Italian task force are here.
I'll mention it just because, as he was demoing it before, and Nitesh brought it up, and it would be an interesting point, especially when Martin hopefully gets back on. But I know Nitesh was saying how, like, a lot of naive users will just copy and paste an error that they see into, like, Google to search for it, and wondering the impact of that since the large, well, assumably the large stock base of like Stack Overflow and those that errors would pop up on are in English. If we lose that ability, if it's only solely translated into the other language, if then they wouldn't be able to Google and get some helpful hints that are already existing on some of the help forums, and wondering what kind of impact that may have.
Would it make sense to print out both so that you have, say, you don't lose the Stack Overflow searchability, but you keep the friendliness of speaking your own language?
Yeah, I think I thought about these lines too. From a developer's point of view too, that would be like something you would like to see if you get an error report from a user. It helps you to see the English one. Hi, Mark.
Yes, that's what I was thinking too. Like if people are copying and pasting onto the support site or something like that.
Sounds like
Martin.
Said, yeah, okay.
Yeah, sorry. I guess the Canadians really did take over. Maybe they have more reliable service than Qualcomm or Spectrum or whatever it is. And I see you guys have launched right into the discussion without need for my presentation, which is great.
I posed the question. I know Nitesh isn't here, he's on vacation, but when it was presented before, I know he kind of mentioned it in passing of if it's only in another language, a lot of naive users will just copy and paste into like a Google search or Stack Overflow, and perhaps it would be worth having at least a dual with the English language so they don't lose like the searchability, since most of the error stockpile database is in English. And also for us, like on our support site or help forum, it would be hard for us to help if we don't know what the error is either.
Yeah, I think there are a number of issues, and that I kind of have a slide a little bit later on there that some of those come up. We could jump there, or let me just keep talking just a little bit more, and then we'll come to those. I think that's really great to think of those things. So I think we got you write stop, you collate these into this .pot file, and it consists of kind of a key, the message ID, and a string that corresponds to that ID. And this string is blank at the moment. And then if you're interested in creating a Spanish translation, you create one of these files, r-es.po, that has a particular structure, and there are tools in R that can help you create this, or actually in Michael's PO tools package. And the .po file has the original message ID and then the translation into Spanish or whichever language you're interested in. And you can translate one or all of the messages in the POT file. In the POT file. And if the translation isn't present, you get the English version of the message. And then finally, you compile the PO file, the various translation files, into a sequence of installed .mo files, which are like the compiled version of these, that actually get installed with the package. And my understanding is that what R does is it says, in stop warning message, or this get text f function, it says, I'm supposed to say something to the user. I'll check out the language locale, the language that's in use, and see if I have any messages for the package I'm currently in. And if I do, I'll present the translation instead of the original. And all of this uses some new software called getText. Some standard tooling there. So the key thing is these getText and getTextF functions at the R level, or also at the C level. And in your own R session, you can say getTextF, whatever the string is, and specify the domain R BioC Manager, so the BioC Manager package. And at the R level is where the translation is occurring. It searches for that MO file and provides you with the translation. And then you can feed this to whatever it is that you want to do. If there isn't a translation, you just get back the untranslated message. So it kind of fails gracefully. And there's also sprintf style interpolation. So BioC Manager install version equals %s with R version %s 312.405, and then you get the 312 and 405 inserted as appropriate. So it's actually pretty straightforward and easy once you kind of get your head around it. There are a few resources. Writing R extensions has a chapter on internationalization. Michael has this PO tools package, which I think is very much under development. But as in conjunction with a data.table. There's a workshop at UseR 2021, translate R to your language. There's a newly created Slack channel in the Bioconductor community Slack if you're interested in participating. And then it seems like other languages have also embarked on the translation journey. And it seems like there'll be other tools in, like the Qt framework has this software called Linguist, which for some reason my Mac OS associated with the .po and .pot files. That's the only reason I know that tool. And the GNOME community has a very large translation network. So just to kind of, I'm wanting to get to the discussion part. We're still learning about lots of things. And actually, even some basic things, I think we is more than just the royal we, like other people in the Bioconductor community. Specifying language on each operating system, there still seem to be some nuances as working with Zhifei on his Chinese language system, trying to get a reliable way of seeing translations that seemed to be quite tricky to navigate that. BioC Manager had its own little scheme for presenting errors to and warnings to users. In particular, it wanted to wrap the warnings to the width of the user's console so that they were sort of nicely formatted. And that means that we didn't call stop or warning or message directly. And because we didn't and don't do that, we couldn't use some of the tooling that's available for automatically generating that .pot file. And instead, we curated it by hand. There are lots of issues with translation and validating translation that can be tricky. Like in an sprintf, you have to have the sequence, %s, %d. %s has to correspond to a character string, %d to a number, and an integer number. And you have to have exactly the right number of %s's and %d's, and so on. And then there are some subtle language issues. Like in BioC Manager, there's a string that says %s, %d packages. And %s is upgrade or downgrade. So it says upgrade 5 packages or downgrade 5 packages. But in some languages, particularly Japanese, you'd like to reorder the subject, object, verb sequence. And so you'd like this translated as %d packages, %s, 5 packages, upgrade. But that's not the way that simple sprintf style variable substitution works. You have to use fancier positional syntax. And probably the solution is to stick to simpler error messages. And then you'd also like at some level, especially in a gateway package like BioC Manager, you'd like to make sure that the error messages were consistent and accurate, and that they didn't adopt, say, idioms that were typical of the language that might not be consistent with code of conduct. For instance, replacing user should with he should, or some sort of gender pronoun that isn't consistent with the code of conduct. And we're still really unsure about how to update translations. Even typos require the retranslation. And there's probably clean ways to do that. It's just that we haven't really figured it out. So this is where I wanted to end up. This is my next to last slide. Here's my last slide. It's the acknowledgement of the translators and some hints on how to do the translation. But is it a good idea? And I've got to say that initially I was totally enthusiastic about it. I thought, this is a no-brainer. Of course it's a good idea. Making R and Bioconductor more accessible to the international user community. And then I guess my own thinking and then some comments as we've been talking about this maybe make us reconsider this a little bit. One is the maintainers have to understand how translation works, and that creates significant technical debt. And I'll say, even as I'm a member of R core, and I've made very few code changes to R core, but I've actually made even fewer than I would have otherwise because I've hesitated over uncertainty about how my changes, which involved adding or changing an error message, fit into the translation machinery. I just didn't understand it. And so when you introduce translation, whoever is maintaining the software has to be comfortable working with the translation machinery. There's another argument that initially sounds, I thought it was, first of all, it came from a non-native English speaker, but I'm not sure that I really know how to parse this, but users require English language skills to work with R and Bioconductor. And understanding stop and warning are comparatively easy compared to understanding, say, vignettes or help pages. And so maybe there's only really a marginal benefit from translation. I mean, I think I kind of counter that with my sort of experience looking over people's shoulders in workshops where they don't understand the error message, and when they Google the error message, sure, they get back a translation. It's kind of broken a little bit sometimes, and then it's out of context, and they have to do that extra work. There's also this comment that I think Glory was mentioning about how adopting a single language for the project simplifies communication, for instance, on the support site. And then I'll say, maybe one of the things I was thinking about when with these translations was, less experienced coders often want to contribute to the project, and this seemed like a great way to get less experienced members involved, translating and having some ownership over the software. But actually, the contributors to date, these people, I'd say we're in the expert realm of software developers. So it's not like we did a general call for translators, but and then thinking about the skills and knowledge that you need about installing R packages from source and package structure and so on. It's actually maybe not such a good way to get experienced members involved. And then there's some additional issues, but I thought these were the ones that were maybe most prominent. So as I say, that's my last slide. I'll keep it up, but maybe we could, for a bit, but maybe we could just open the floor for questions or comments about, either the technical or the philosophical aspects of it.
I'd like to raise a very basic technical question, and I wonder whether folks have thought about this. I wonder why this was done at the package level. It seemed to me that there's a stock of phrases that could populate a database and then could all be translated. And that would be a feature of the language rather than the packages. And there'd be a way of contributing to the stock of texts that need to be translated. Has that issue been discussed in this whole translation methodology for R?
I guess I can mention if there is already in base R, one of these message IDs in the pod file for R itself, you could just reuse that. You would just have to specify the domain. So that is possible in as much as the exact phrase is already available in base R. I think putting it in packages is probably about decentralization, where each package is going to have a sequence of messages that are probably totally unique to that package itself. But yeah, it would be possible to bootstrap off of what base R has already done.
So a follow-up comment, then you can imagine BioBase has a set of standard messages. On the other hand, now that introduced dependencies, and there is no way to specify dependencies and messages, so it will randomly break downstream. So sounds like a complicated thing.
I guess also to piggyback that off and thinking of something that Vince said the other day too, of in base R or anything, is there the concept of like error codes and using like the codes for a section of errors or similar errors? Because it seems like we've gotten away from like error codes that would have like a generic semi idea of what's going on, maybe not the specific, but give you a hint.
Yeah.
And that would be more generalized.
Yeah. I mean, I was actually thinking that this message ID, MSG ID, I'm not actually sure about this, but I was thinking that actually it was originally meant to be like an error code. This is like the repo arg not allowed, repo arg not allowed is the message ID, and the message string in the POT file is the actual message. That I guess I don't understand why there's the message string entry in the POT file. I'll just say also that kind of ties in with a common, wish, which is that, when you get when R signals an error, like a condition, you don't have any way of catching a particular condition. Like you couldn't catch this repo argument to install not allowed, except by grepping for it in the condition message after the fact. And of course, if you have a translation, then you can't grep. Then you have to grep for the translation as well. So I don't know. I thought actually this message ID would be really interesting as a if it could be used that way, it could sort of win twice.
Yeah, I agree. The error code could help remove, if that would be part of the message too, that would definitely help removing ambiguity.
I don't know, Mike, do you know about the sort of duality here of the message ID and message SDR in the POP file?
Yeah, this is about how XGet text works. So the POT file, the T I believe stands for template. So the POT file just has like the message ID entries, and then the PO files are like validated and updated against that. Yeah, I think it's just how the machinery is working for XGet text itself. That this POT file always just has the message IDs and then blank message.
Would the message ID, so the error IDs still put some extra weight on the developers if they have to kind of, fit their messages and kind of know what error message they should raise? And so because kind of someone has to pay a price somehow.
So Martin, your thought here is like even English should be translated from a standard code.
Yeah, or that this is like the message STR and the POT file is like the default in whatever language.
It seems like that was the original thought.
Yeah, but we should explore it though.
Yeah.
So when the message isn't translated, is it the contents of the message ID string that gets printed out? So if that was like ID 500, it would just say error 500, which may be helpful, may not be, I don't know. Maybe that would be perfect, right? Then you just have a web page with them on. Whenever I get an HTTP return code, I have to go and look them up on Wikipedia, right? And there's a nice page and it just tells me. And I'm sure there's one on the Wikipedia page in every language that would tell you what that meant.
You can also imagine a fallback system where we're saying if it can't translate to French, fall back to Italian and then English, and then finally, if there's nothing, message ID.
There is a little bit of a sense of that fallback, but not quite in that way. So this says ZH_CN. This is Robert Costello straightened me out. They're not dialects; they're varieties of language. So this is they're simplified Chinese. So the CN is simplified and the ZH is Chinese, and there's a ZH_TW or something like that, the traditional Chinese. So you have forms of the language.
Martin, but I think the suffix is the country.
Yeah, so I think it's more common in Spanish. Like there's an ES-AR for Argentina. I think it's ES for Spain, ES-MX for Mexico. And if you have an ES translation PO file and an ES-AR translation PO file, and the user is in Argentina, and the message is translated in Spanish but not Argentinian Spanish, whenever it'll back up to the Spanish version if the Argentinian version is not there. So I think BaseR does this for British English messages. So there's a British English PO file, and some of the messages are translated into British English, and that's in ESGB, I think, and it backs up to the normal English PO file if the British translation is not there.
Opens up funny avenue of how the British English messages would sound like, oh dear.
Well, Martin, you could have an EN_CA.
Yeah.
So English for Canada, if.
Yeah.
What
about? Go ahead. Sorry. Go ahead.
I just thought about summarizing the pros and cons with this, and you said, the obvious one is to help the end user. I say it's like for developers, there's also that you get an overview of your messages.
Yeah.
And eventually, like, you might standardize your messages.
Yeah.
And now it's like kind of hard to do that. I have to do code inspection to pull them out, and I guess the PO tools will do that. The downside from standardizing messages, you might actually hold back on giving very detailed information in the messages because you want to keep them simple. And another con with this translation is like, I don't know if it's a con, but there would be like a lag in translation time. When you release something, should you just release a new version and then wait for the developers to contribute to package with updates and do another release? And that's more of a problem in CRAN maybe than in Bioconductor. And then what we brought up when we lost you before is like that losing the original message, which is like English by default, basically. And that is very useful for searching, brought up, Googling, finding, but also for the developers when you get an error report. I think you got one today somewhere with a Chinese error message, and it's like, for me, that's like, I don't know. So that immediately is like a blocker for people to help and the developers troubleshoot.
Yeah, just to comment on that. So I did in BioC Parallel, there is an error message that was reported, and of course BioC Parallel itself hasn't translated its error messages. The translation was from base R. So in some ways, that's already kind of present out there in the wild where people can post foreign languages. But for me, what I did, was I Googled it, Google Translate, to see what it said, which is what we're asking our users to do. And in some ways, as the experienced R user, it's like shifting the burden to the person who knows the ins and outs of R like the back of their hand, as opposed to the user who's trying to get off the ground. So in some ways, the ease of Googling actually seems like it shifts some burden to the developer, but maybe not that much. And it's the right direction for the burden to be shifted.
So I think, I thought about this as like what would it take to keep the original message?
Yeah.
Basically, technically we would say like don't translate it until you render. And the way I actually come up and thought about this too is like when you run in parallel on distributed systems, you might actually have a different language set on the parallel workers. So
leave you, Henrik, to think of it that way.
Yeah, no, but it's a very helpful thing to think about, and there's another point I want to say about line breaks. I say it now. You don't really know you can't really decide what it should look like when the error is produced. You can really only tell that when it's rendered, and also, like doing line breaks in messages, that complicates other things, like as you mentioned, like translations. But if you capture an error message, you might capture it in parallel with a certain line width. It will look like super funny when you render those captured in the middle of other messages. So it's like messages. The message system is like errors, warnings, and messages. There are conditions, and translations forces you to think about them in a different way. So ideally for me, it's like if one could carry on the original message or delay the translation till the end. But then the problem is like then you can't. What do you do with when you have an error message that composes of two get text that you paste together? You basically have to carry them along until the very end and then evaluate that. There's no longer just a string that you pass along in your conditions. It's a call. And then maybe in order to resolve that call, you need to get access to original objects, and they are only there when you capture the error. So It's not easy.
Yeah. Vince,
Oh, maybe worth mentioning is that, all right, so you mentioned if we have two strings, we kind of have to keep both along in order to translate them. You could kind of hack the pot file to have string 1 in the pot file and translate it, string 2 in the pot file and translate it, and then the combination of string 1 and string 2 and translate that as well. That is not really like scalable in the sense that if you have a bunch of different components, you'd have to like combinatorially come up with translations for all of them. But in a limited sense, it would kind of work.
Interesting. You're thinking about like code inspection and finding the existing combinations, and then you automatically generate those.
You could, I guess in principle you could, or if there's only a small number. I think another context to have in mind for BioC Manager is that I believe there's only like 30 or 40 messages to begin with. So it is pretty limited in that sense, and much more manageable than really big packages would get. Yeah. And base R does this itself. There's one or two places in base R where there's a compile versus runtime difference in translation. And basically there's a way to mark the string so that you recognize the string at compile time, but it doesn't get translated until runtime. So I think that gets to what you have in mind.
Vince?
You may have already dealt with this, but I just wondered whether a good error message also has some data in it, oftentimes. And, like foo has to be positive. You need to tell the user that foo is the variable they're working with. Is that straightened out? Can you already pass data into these things which doesn't get translated? Or?
Well, there are actually two things. Like, so there is this sprintf kind of, sorry, stupid keyboard. This sprintf kind of interpolation, so you can inject things. But also, like, you could imagine, you have stop, and you have a phrase that says your data is all messed up, and then the next argument to stop is, the vector of values that are non-negative. And so you'd translate and stop would translate the part that said your data is all messed up. And then the vector of bad values wouldn't be translated. So they're kind of like two levels of injecting data into the message. One is as part of the message itself, and the other is sort of taking advantage of the way that stop and so on works.
I mean, the most obvious one is like file not found, maybe. I mean, there's like software saying file not found. And it doesn't tell you what the file is. But you would say file not found, translated.
So can I try to shift a little bit the conversation from the technical to the philosophical aspect? Just because I cannot, contribute much to the technical part. But I think Martin mentioned that perhaps the error message is not really the problem for non-native speakers. And like to work with Bioconductor, you have to know a little bit of English. You have to read vignettes. You have to, So if the goal of this is increase accessibility for non-native speakers, I'm wondering if like a first easier step would be to, start translating vignettes of popular packages into other languages, which seems much more straightforward from a technical point of view. You just add one more vignette in a different language. And this could really be a community effort where new and less experienced users could contribute, right? Even like workshops at BioC Asia or BioC Europe could do that, right?
Yeah, there is some precedent for that. So BioC Asia had workshops in Chinese, and Matt Ritchie has been involved in translating some of the RNA-seq workflow vignettes into Chinese. And it's like you say, it's just another vignette. It could be added to any package. I think it's quite a bit of work, though, right?
Yeah, it probably also to keep them in sync if there's a new update for say from the main one, and then say, is the translated one broken, or if it breaks, right? So for what it's worth, I mean, in this direction, also because of the global dimension that UseArt is this year taking, not just also because of the workshop that Mike and Michael are offering there, but also there are quite some, say, workshops and lectures that are offered in non-English language. So many of them are, say, for I think I counted Spanish, many of them, and French some. I don't remember if I've seen, say, Chinese ones, but say there are also at this kind of global conference some effort that try to put this forward.
There is a paradoxical response to Mike's tweet earlier today from someone suggesting that internationalization might be most appropriate when you had a user community that was narrowly focused in a non-English language, and that this sort of adopting a single language, the lingua franca of communication, made sense when you were, like, just having English made actually more sense when you had a global project like Bioconductor.
I think that there is an effect that we may not be able to foresee now, which is that if you have R is already translated into several languages, so if you have a number of packages translated in other languages, there might be people who teach to each other stuff, or they organize. I'm thinking sometimes in this local R clubs, R ladies, or whatever, in some corner of the world, where they do sort of work on those translations in ways that we don't foresee. So we are not aware that somebody is benefiting from a translation of R into Portuguese in Brazil or something. It's difficult to assess that. And something I wanted also to comment regarding the burden that may bring up on the support side with errors that are not in English. Probably we should think about how could we have an easier way to switch language, in the sense that we could say in the support side, please post the error in English, but that means that the user should have an easy way to switch it. And by now, my understanding is that the only way to switch the language is to change the language setting at the regional level of the operating system, like updating some environment variable. While, for instance, there is this project called Swirl for learning R with interactively. They have a function called select language, and you change the language with a function call. I don't know how they do it exactly, but if we could have something along those lines to facilitate switching the language, then that could be a good feature.
The support site could have a translate button. Translate the post to Farsi or whatever.
Yeah, I think that's actually a pretty good idea. I think you could internally control some state variable, and if you pass domain equals NA to any of the translating functions, it won't try to translate it. So you could toggle whether the domain is the default domain or English within the package environment. I think that would work pretty well.
Canadians are here. I got the flight alarm monthly test here. I don't know if it disturbs you, but it's so that comes back to my thought of like delaying the translation, because if you run like pipelines takes like a long time to run and you get an error, end user can't be bothered to rerun it again and wait for like a day to get the same error in another language. And maybe it's a random error. So it would be super nice to be able to like translate last error. And another comment I want to say is like translating error message is kind of a natural thing, maybe warnings, but message conditions, they're used in so many different ways. They're used to like render progress bars and make things look nice. So I think it's a daunting task to try to like attack also anything within the message call. I don't know how you think about it, but it's...
From the technical side of things, I just wanted to say that many of the discussions here seem to be making things more complicated, but if I were to take a lesson learned from my last month is to actually make things simpler and to like throw out my message wrapping functionality and stick with plain calls to stop and so on. I'll also say that it did make me reflect on the messages. So like it was a good experience to collate the messages and think about why they are phrased the way they are. And the sort of two clever parts like of how I formulated messages in BioC Manager are just coming back to bite me. So it's like a keep it simple kind of philosophy.
Out of interest, how many people answer questions that aren't on the packages they actively kind of wrote the code for in the first place? Because so typically I either answer a question about a package I know, and then I probably have access to the list of translations in the POP file, and I probably have looked at it a few times and that kind of thing. It should probably be easy for me to recognize it no matter what language it's written in. Or I'm answering a question about something really fundamental in R, right? Like it's a package installation error or something along those lines. And to be honest, I think I can read those in most languages anyway. But I know what it looks like. It doesn't actually matter what the words are. I kind of know what command someone's written, and it prints something that looks like package not available. Or maybe I guess I'm kind of saying I'm not sure it's a problem for me that I either have access to the translations or I don't need it translated at all. I don't know if that applies to other people. I'm not picking up my language skills there, but more my familiarity with what comes out of an R terminal, I guess.
Is there an official position by the R core about this? I mean, alone the fact that they are offering this workshop, say via Michael, Lawrence, and Mike, could be a sign, right? Or I mean, and just wondering whether we do things that are useful to us and then are not somehow not picked up at the central level and then end up being kind of I'm not saying rejected, but more like not picked up at a more, I don't know, global level somehow. And by saying that, I mean that there is value in translating messages because we are probably in a privileged situation right now that we are experienced users, mostly. And many of the newcomers are just not. So I just think of myself 10 years ago, for example, and say reading a vignette was not automatically my first thought, and it became my first thought afterwards.
Yeah.
Or knowing how to parse through the documentation, for example, alone that there's quite an added value to that, and especially say we are all educated people that have say reasonably nice English skill set, but say many people say across the world are not so lucky as we are. And yet they shouldn't be kind of cut out of enjoying this, right? I don't know how other languages kind of deal with that. So R has a positive fame of trying to be inclusive, and that's that's a nice kind of a predominant kind of skill or feature that we have. But say, how are the other main languages dealing with that? Is there anyone aware with, say, I don't know, the newcomers, Julia or Python, right? So not starting a war here. It's more like to kind of get a status quo on what they do or plan to do.
Maybe some quick comments. One is that the translation machinery has been in base R for a number of years, probably more than 10 or 15 anyway. And then every release, there's a call for translation. So there's like this translation team that is meant to update the translations. So it's an ongoing and central and well-supported effort. Michael Lawrence actually leads or has led the translation team. Mike has some interesting data on the number of R messages, when they were last translated, the number of messages that are updated in each of the languages, each release. And initially there's a big effort, and then subsequently it's much more modest, just tens or hundreds of messages per release for all of R. So that's kind of interesting. I think it's also interesting to, if you look at visitors to our support site, for instance, English is the browser is in English for the majority of our visitors, and then Chinese, and then there's like this exponential decay. So by the time you're talking about, say, Portuguese, we're actually, pretty far out in the tail of the audience, at least visiting the website. So it's kind of interesting to think about, in a strictly prioritization world, we'd have English and Chinese as the language, as the translations, if we were trying to reach the largest audience. But of course, if we were trying to be inclusive, we'd really want to go out as far along that tail as possible.
Could that actually be a classical example of that photo of the plane that got shot and landed?
Right.
You actually don't get the audience
right.
that needs the translation.
Right, yeah.
I mean, it's also because for the same reason of the Googleability of the errors that you find, it's much easier to have support for your browser in English. And that's why I say use my English software, browser. My OS and so browsers and all of this stuff in English, because if there's an error, then that's much easier to find again. So I count as an English visitor probably.
Yes. Right, I see. So you shot down that idea, yeah.
Nah, it's more like it's probably an imperfect proxy like all proxies, yes. Right?
Vince, do you?
I don't know if we have to close at the hour, but I wanted to see whether we have an action item. So this has been inspiring to me. I think there's been a moment of technical revenue when you said, I factored out all my messages and I had to look at them in isolation and think about them. And it makes me think that, I've got a couple of packages. There's probably not that many messages in them. So if I went through the factoring process and then used Mike's PO tools or whatever it is to help generate whatever files need to be produced, and then used Google Translate to do some translations, would I get to a point where I've got an internationalized package? Should I try that?
I think that if you do that, the natives in that language will be upset enough with the terrible translations that they'll fix it for you.
I think the sentences might be too compact and short for Google Translate to do a good job, probably.
I can comment.
The language model that the translator is using is, say, not coding friendly. Let's put it like this.
Better than nothing, though?
Better than nothing, though. I agree.
Interesting. So finding some volunteers who will do idiomatic translation would be the desirable thing to do.
I can make one comment. I tried Mike's PO tools, and one thing I immediately liked, it's finding stop calls that doesn't use sprintf, but some kind of paste. And so I still haven't decided what to do here, but my first action item is to change my stop and warnings to use sprintf, because then the next step to use getTextf is like small. You can actually take that first step.
I was wondering,
oh, sorry.
well, just because we're just at the end of the hour, I was wondering, I think everyone has, I don't think Blue Jeans offers us the technology here, but I think everyone has to turn on their cameras. But I was wondering if those in favor of translation going ahead, maybe just a straw poll, of in BioC Manager, in favor. And opposed? Excellent. So, Michael, what's the deal?
For me, Mike Smith, yeah.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yeah, there isn't many Michaels here. I think for me, it's the Googleability. So it's not just that the burden is shifted towards the developer who has to back translate to help, but it's also that I'm learning a lot from things I find on the internet that other people have discussed with each other without me being in the loop, old things often. And if those things are happening in a different language, I might not be able to find those. So for me, that's a bit of a deal breaker. And in a way, I'm very much with you. I think the errors, if they had unique codes, that would even make it simpler to find error messages. And even the English one should then maybe be a translation of that code. But that's just my personal opinion.
No, that's good. That's useful to hear. And it's definitely true that Google is our friend when that's what you do. You grab the error message and Google it.
So could one imagine inject technical solutions again, but could you imagine somehow generate a unique code from the message ID, having another layer wrapper that generates that code plus the translated message?
All right. Well, I guess we're at the hour. It's been a really interesting discussion, and I've really enjoyed the foray so far. I hope to continue iterating on BioC Manager, but with no guarantees. So it's such an important package. I wouldn't make language changes without higher authority. So hopefully there'll be that discussion, and we'll move it forward. It's a lot of fun anyway. I've explored it so far.
Thanks for the invite, Martin, and thanks for having the talk.
Yeah, thanks for coming by. Look forward to your workshop.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye, everyone.